Let's talk about life post-wedding. Has the fact that your sister now has taken on this enormous role, not only as a mom, but in her role with the royal family, has it changed your relationship?
A famous last name, a husband from old money, 2 children, a country estate, a life that millions of people looked at through the glass of their phones and thought that's what happiness looks like. Not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Pippa Middleton was never supposed to be the complicated one. That role, the world had already assigned to her sister. Pippa was the steady one, the grounded one, the one who smiled at cameras without flinching, who wore the right dress at the right moment, who seemed to have quietly and perfectly engineered a life that made complete sense. She was the one you didn't worry about, the one who was going to be fine, and for years, she was. But something was shifting underneath all of it, slowly at first, so slowly you could almost miss it, and then all at once. People close to her began noticing small things, a tension behind the eyes that photographs couldn't quite flatten, a distance in certain public appearances that hadn't been there before, words left unsaid in interviews that seemed to carry more weight than the ones that made it out. Then the reports started coming, not loud ones, not the kind that explode across front pages in big bold letters with unnamed sources and breathless phrasing. These were quieter, the kind that settle into tabloid columns and royal-adjacent circles and simply don't let go. Questions were being raised about her marriage, about her state of mind, about what had really been happening behind the composed exterior she had spent over a decade carefully maintaining. And once those questions were out there, they had a way of pulling on everything. At 41, Pippa Middleton was no longer just the sister in the background. She was the story, and the story, according to those who had been watching closely, was far more layered, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than anyone had been prepared to admit. To understand what happened, you have to go back to before any of this, back to before the cameras, before the headlines, before the world decided who she was. You have to go back to a small village in Berkshire called Bucklebury, the kind of place where children still play in fields and neighbors know each other by name, where life moves at a pace that doesn't ask very much of you. That's where Pippa grew up, and it mattered more than people gave it credit for. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, were self-made in the most grounded sense of the phrase. They hadn't inherited anything. They had built something, Party Pieces, a party supply company that started small and grew steadily into something real and sustaining. The family wasn't royal, wasn't aristocratic, wasn't connected to the kind of world that would eventually come calling. They were, by most accounts, simply close, warm, the kind of family that talks to each other and means it. Pippa and Catherine grew up inside that warmth together. Same schools, overlapping social circles, a sisterhood that read from the outside, at least as genuinely affectionate rather than simply inherited. When Catherine began dating Prince William at the University of St. Andrews, the Middleton family did something that many families in that position have failed to do. They didn't fracture. They absorbed the pressure quietly, gracefully, as a unit. Pippa stood beside her sister at the 2011 royal wedding as maid of honor. And then something happened that no one had exactly planned for. A single image, a single moment in Westminster Abbey, walking down the aisle in a fitted ivory Alexander McQueen gown, and almost overnight, Pippa Middleton ceased to be a private individual. Fan pages appeared within hours. News segments followed. Think pieces multiplied. People who had never followed the British royal family in their lives suddenly knew her name, her face, her silhouette. It was the kind of attention that arrives like weather. You don't invite it. You can't return it. You can only decide what to do once it's already there. To her credit, Pippa didn't chase it. She didn't feed it. She wrote a book, a lifestyle guide that received mixed reviews, but demonstrated something more important than critical praise, a desire to be taken seriously. On her own terms, she worked in events and hospitality. She wrote a column. She ran marathons. She competed in triathlons and ski races, pushing herself through physical challenges the way some people push through emotional ones, as if motion itself were a kind of answer. There was something almost deliberate about the way she kept moving, as if staying in motion was its own form of protection against everything the stillness might bring. Then, in 2017, she married James Matthews. James was a hedge fund manager, wealthy, privately educated, the kind of man who moves through rooms with quiet authority and doesn't need to explain himself. His younger brother Spencer had appeared on the reality television series Made in Chelsea, which gave the Matthews name a certain tabloid familiarity that James himself seemed to resist. With particular determination, he was the serious one, the numbers man, the one who kept his personal life behind closed doors and seemed to prefer it that way. Their wedding, held at St. Mark's Church in Berkshire, was understated by the standards of what the Middleton family had become: elegant, well-organized, and by every visible measure, the beginning of something solid. They bought a home in Chelsea, then a larger property in the English countryside. A son, Arthur, arrived in 2018, a daughter, Grace, in 2021. A third child followed. From the outside, the picture was complete, enviably complete, the kind of life that other lives get measured against. But pictures, as anyone who has ever stared at one for too long begins to realize, only ever capture the surface. What lives underneath that surface, the weight, the silence, the things that don't photograph, is a different matter entirely. For the first several years of their marriage, Pippa and James seemed to be doing exactly what people in their position are supposed to do: building quietly, living carefully, staying out of trouble. James had no appetite for attention, and Pippa seemed to settle naturally into that rhythm. After the initial surge of post-wedding fame, she had gradually receded from the front pages, not because anything had gone wrong, but because she appeared to have made a deliberate choice to protect what she was building. She gave interviews occasionally, but they were measured, controlled. She appeared at charity events and sporting competitions. She posted selectively on social media. When she posted at all, there was a sense, among people who followed these things, that Pippa had finally found her footing. She was no longer just Catherine's sister, or the woman in the white dress, or the reluctant celebrity who had stumbled into a global spotlight. She was a wife, a mother, a woman in her late 30s with a life of genuine texture, interests, community. Children who needed her present, not performing. It looked, from the outside, like someone who had figured something out. And yet, even inside that apparent calm, there were small notes of tension accumulating, quietly, in the background, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking. Reports from 2022 and into 2023 suggested that the Middleton family itself was navigating something significant. Party Pieces, the business her parents had spent decades building from nothing, went into administration. It was a quiet collapse. No scandal, no wrongdoing, just the slow, grinding reality of a business that could no longer sustain itself, and the silent devastation that follows when something you built with your own hands simply ceases to exist. For a family that had built its entire identity on self-reliance and quiet achievement, this was not a small thing. It was a loss that went beyond finances. It was the loss of a story they had told about themselves, that they were people who built things, who held things together, who made something from nothing and kept it standing. Pippa was a daughter before she was anything else, and daughters carry the weight of their parents' pain in ways that don't always show up in photographs. It was around this time that something in the larger picture began to shift. Reports started emerging, carefully worded, sourced to unnamed individuals described as close to the family, suggesting that things inside the Matthews household were not entirely as composed as they appeared. No accusations, no declarations, just the kind of cautious, hedged language that people use when they have something to say but not quite enough to say it plainly. According to various reports, questions were being raised about the emotional dynamics of the marriage, about whether what existed between Pippa and James was still functioning the way it once had, or whether something had quietly come loose. James, according to some accounts, was described as someone who maintained a significant emotional distance, even from those he loved. People who knew him well, or claimed to, described a man who was not unkind, but who was perhaps not particularly available in the emotional register that a marriage, especially one under sustained external pressure, eventually demands. Pippa, by contrast, had always been described in warmer terms: engaged, attentive, someone who remembered details about people, who showed up fully, who invested in the people around her. When do people operate on fundamentally different emotional frequencies? The gap between them is manageable until the moment something difficult arrives, and suddenly it isn't. It's important to note that no official statements were made during this period. No separations announced. No lawyers publicly engaged. No official conclusion was reached. What existed were whispers, impressions, and the particular kind of heavy silence. That restraint carries its own consequences. Pressure that isn't released doesn't disappear. It relocates into the body, into the relationship, into the quiet spaces of a life that were never meant to hold so much, and often without anyone intending it. The relationship that ends up bearing the most weight is the one that was never supposed to carry any at all. James Matthews, by all accounts, had not been built for this kind of emotional complexity. His world was structured around clarity, outcomes, results, things that could be measured and managed. The particular chaos that surrounded the Middleton family during this period, the grief and visibility and unrelenting scrutiny, did not translate neatly into the language he spoke naturally. This is not a condemnation of him. It is simply the honest recognition that two people can care deeply about each other and still find themselves, in a moment of real need, speaking in entirely different tongues. According to reports from 2023, conversations between them had become strained. Questions about where to live, how to raise their children, how much of their lives to protect versus share had shifted from being decisions they made together into sources of quiet friction. No official word came, but the distance, according to those with knowledge of the situation, was real and growing. There's a version of Pippa Middleton that the public has always been most comfortable with: the composed one, the well-dressed one, the woman who runs marathons and writes about entertaining and makes the whole thing look effortless. That version is real, but it is not the complete picture. What began emerging through personal accounts, shared carefully, in the measured language of people describing something still unresolved, was the portrait of a woman who had spent years quietly absorbing things that had no proper place to go, and who had reached, at some point, a quiet and private limit. The loss of her parents' business had hit harder than was publicly acknowledged. The emotional toll of watching her sister navigate extraordinary pain while cameras rolled, the complicated mix of helplessness and love and grief that comes with that, had taken something from her that wasn't easily replenished. The accumulated weight of parenting 3 young children, managing a household, maintaining a marriage that required more than she felt was being returned. All of it had been building, layer by layer, in the way that things build when you don't put them down often enough. According to reports, those close to Pippa described a period in which she became more withdrawn, more reflective, less willing to perform the version of herself the world had come to expect. She was, in the words of someone described in one account as a family friend, going through something private and significant, a description careful enough to protect her, and precise enough to make clear that something genuine had shifted. What that something was, in its full and exact complexity, has not been fully stated by anyone with authority to do so. No official conclusion has been reached. What has been raised, carefully and in qualified terms, is the question of whether her marriage was giving her what she needed during this period, whether the man beside her was truly able to meet her in the place she had arrived at, whether the life they had built together, as beautiful as it appeared from the outside, had the structural depth to hold the weight of everything now pressing down on it. These are not small questions. They are the kind that don't arrive with easy answers, the kind that people carry around for months, even years, turning them over quietly before they're willing to answer them honestly, even to themselves. And according to those who watch this period closely, Pippa sat with them for a long time before she did anything else. What makes her story genuinely difficult to tell simply is that it refuses simplification. There's no villain here. James Matthews has not been cast as one in any credible account. There are no confirmed betrayals, no explosive revelations, no single defining moment that the narrative can anchor itself to neatly. What there is instead is something far more human and therefore far more complicated to people who may have grown, over time, into different versions of themselves than the ones who stood at that altar in Berkshire in 2017. That happens. It happens quietly, without anyone intending it, in even the most carefully constructed lives, according to reports circulating in late 2023 and into 2024. Questions about the state of their marriage had become increasingly difficult to avoid. Sources described, in careful terms, a household that was functioning but strained, a couple managing their responsibilities as parents with visible dedication, while navigating in the private spaces between those responsibilities, something that remained unresolved. It was also during this period, according to various accounts, that Pippa had begun to speak, quietly, selectively, to people she genuinely trusted about what she was feeling, not publicly, not in any arena that invited cameras or commentary, in the private way that people begin to speak when they have finally decided to stop holding something alone. What she reportedly shared was not anger, not bitterness. It was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to sit with, a kind of grief, not for one specific lost thing, but for the slow erosion of something she had believed was permanent, a recognition that the life she had worked so carefully and deliberately to build had developed cracks that she had been smoothing over for longer than she'd realized. There's also a deeper question woven through all of this, one raised gently in several accounts, about identity. Who is Pippa Middleton outside the roles the world assigned her? Outside sister, outside wife, outside mother, outside the woman in the white dress at Westminster Abbey? These questions tend to arrive in a person's early 40s with particular force. They don't come with instructions. They don't arrive gently. They come in the quiet hours, in the space between the life you're living and the life you imagined. They come when the image you've been projecting and the interior you've been protecting no longer match, and you find that you are no longer willing or able to pretend they do. According to those who spoke with care about this period, Pippa had arrived at exactly that reckoning. The exterior remained intact, but something inside it had been named, quietly, truthfully, and without any possibility of being unnamed again. What do you do with a story like this? That's the question that stays with you once you've spent time inside it. It doesn't resolve cleanly. It doesn't offer the satisfaction of a clear answer or a neat conclusion. And perhaps that honesty is the most meaningful thing about it, because real life, especially the lives of people carrying private pain beneath public visibility, almost never resolves cleanly either. Pippa Middleton is 41 years old. She has 3 children she is clearly devoted to. She has a public identity she has spent years carefully tending, and a private interior that has, by all accounts, been quietly asking for more honesty than that tending allowed. What she is going through, or what reports suggest she has been navigating, is not unusual. It is, in fact, deeply ordinary. The particular collision of external pressure and personal loss and marital strain and identity questioning that seems to define this chapter of her life is something that millions of women move through quietly every year, without headlines, without photographs, without anyone watching. The difference, for Pippa, is that she moves through it with cameras nearby and the last name that guarantees the world's attention arrives whether she invites it or not. That difference matters, not because it makes her pain more significant than anyone else's, but because it makes it more visible, and therefore more vulnerable to being flattened into something simpler, cleaner, and less true than it actually is. The tabloid version of this story wants a scandal, wants a villain, wants a single decisive moment it can point to and explain. The human version of this story is far less satisfying and far more real. It is about 2 people who may have needed different things and waited too long to say so out loud. It is about a woman who carried more than her share and eventually, carefully, put some of it down. It is about the quiet kind of courage, the kind that doesn't make headlines, that it takes to be honest about your own life when the world has already made up its mind about what that life is. No official conclusion has been reached. No final statements have been issued. The story is still moving, still unresolved, still being lived by real people who never agreed to have it narrated by strangers. But somewhere inside all of it, past the headlines, past the careful sourcing, Past the photographs that show you only what the surface is willing to offer, there's a woman who has been through something genuine, something that cost her, something that changed her in ways that won't fully be visible for a long time yet. And that, quietly, is worth sitting with. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think about the distance between what a life looks like and what it actually feels like to live it, share that in the comments. Those are the conversations worth having. And if you want to keep exploring stories told this way, with care and without shortcuts, subscribe and stay with us. There's more worth telling.